Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are looking at Marx, Engels, and the anarchists. I won't go into too much detail. We're going to leave that to the discussion afterwards. As always, we have an introduction tonight by Ian Spencer, and then I'm going to ask him some questions before people from the floor can come in and ask their own questions. Without further ado, over to you, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. The question is, why in this day and age would anyone bother talking about people like Bakunin or Proudhon and some of the others I'm going to mention? What I'm going to argue is that many of the debates that were taking place between Marx and Bakunin in particular, but I will mention some of the other anarchists as well, do contain grains of debates which are current today. Some on the left, at least, don't seem to have learned the lessons of their own history. However, there are some kind of central themes which do regularly turn up and, of course, are very important in the context of a discussion about Marx and the anarchists, Marx, Engels, and the anarchists. So what kind of party or organization versus the class? To what extent can a party or organization act as a substitute for the class? Should it be an organization of tightly knit revolutionaries or open and operating legally? Can we talk about there being as it were, a universal class with a universal struggle and the type of organization that then throws up? Or are there kind of, as it were, national roads to socialism? That became particularly important when we come to look at, for example, the Russian Marxists, but that'll be a later session. And then, of course, at the heart of the whole debate is the question of the state and what Marxists mean by the state, what Marxists mean by the dictatorship of the proletariat, and, of course, the distinctions which exist, of course, in anarchism too, between, for example, individualist and social anarchism, and also the role of other classes within the context of the society of the time, the role of the peasantry, and of course the lumpen proletariat. My first person I want to draw attention to probably wouldn't thank me for calling him an anarchist. I don't think he ever regarded himself as anything of the sort. He regarded himself as a socialist. He was a revolutionist. But Louis-Auguste Blanqui was held in some regard by Marx, if only for his dedication to the cause and courage. A well-educated man, he studied both law and medicine, and took part in the revolutionary events in France in 1830, and tended to form tight-knit conspiratorial secret societies, the aim of which was insurrection. This is an important point because, of course, when we talk about revolution, what exactly do we mean? From the point of view of Blanqui, he didn't regard the proletariat as being something, as a class that could act in a collective manner, and therefore regarded it necessary for a tightly knit band of revolutionaries to take power, to seize state power by force in an insurrection, and on the strength of that, impose a dictatorship which would bring socialism about, impose a dictatorship, for example, which would socialize the means of production. His dedication to the cause is unquestionable. In 1840, he was condemned to death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment. He was subsequently released and immediately set about insurrectionary actions again, which led to him being sentenced to a further 10 years after taking part in the revolutions of 1848. He escaped and returned to France following a general amnesty, and was sentenced to death yet again, but it was also commuted. The thing about Blanqui was, although I've kind of included him here in the anarchists because there is a theme that crops up again and again in terms of how do we organize? Can we organize as a series of sort of tightly organized conspiratorial sects, or should we organize in broad-based political parties which anybody can join, for example? His release was demanded by the Paris Commune in 1871, but he was imprisoned and had to sit out the entire Commune. The other reason for introducing him is, of course, the term Blanquist has become a kind of epithet thrown against certain people on the left over the time. And believe it or not, Edward Bernstein, the revisionist social democrat, accused Marx of Blanquism. Various people over time have accused Lenin of being a Blanquist, in the sense of having a conception of the party which was rooted in a tightly knit group of revolutionaries rather than the class itself, and therefore drawing this distinction between, do we have an organization which serves as a substitute for the class, or can the class only act for itself? As you'll know from sessions on the First International, one of the striking opening lines of the inaugural address to the International Working Men's Association was that the act of the liberation of the working class is the act of the workers themselves. So where does that leave the role of revolutionaries, conscious revolutionaries who want to take theory as a guide to political action and put it into practice, and by assumption bring something to the general consciousness of the working people that isn't naturally there? It doesn't necessarily form spontaneously. Blanqui had no real expectation that the working class, crushed as they were by their poverty and long hours of work, would have time to develop political ideas which would lead to the transformation of society. And of course, that comes up as a central theme in Lenin's What Is to Be Done Later. So to what extent is the accusation of Blanquism being leveled at Lenin in any way justified? The first person really to identify himself as an anarchist was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. I mentioned him briefly in the first session. Proudhon was an enormously influential figure. Proudhon really didn't publish any kind of critique of Marx as such, because Marx was a relatively insignificant figure among the French workers at the time that Proudhon was writing. By trade, he was a printer and compositor. He was largely self-educated. He taught himself Latin, for example, so that he could set the type for Latin texts more easily. He apart from working as a printer and compositor and proofreader, he effectively taught himself Hegelian philosophy. And of course he met Marx while Marx was in exile in Paris. As I mentioned previously, these two had been firm friends but fell out. Marx was notoriously prickly about theoretical ideas, and as we saw when we talked about his meetings with Weitling, something that Marx abhorred was the simple idea of political activity for its own sake, just simply going off and launching an insurrection or stirring up a mass of workers to take part in a fight which was doomed to fail, was to Marx anathema, because for Marx, the aim was to have a kind of scientific understanding of the forces and balance of forces that one is up against, as a means of properly putting forward a scientific approach to the transformation of society. So, for example, in Proudhon's work around what is property and the philosophy of poverty, famously, Proudhon is credited with the phrase that all property is theft. Well, apparently, Proudhon made a number of statements about property, and his tendency to use phrases like all property is theft was done as much as a rhetorical flourish as anything else. For Marx, you see, this was something he wanted to get away from. He wanted to get away from the idea of the demand for socialism as a kind of moral claim, or as as something which was just about an appeal to an emotional fight against injustice. For Marx, it was about the uncovering the laws of motion in social development, following on from Hegel, of course, the laws of motion, so that the idea that history is a series of accidents is a feature that we find in bourgeois historiography. You only have to watch some dreadful rubbish by Lucy Worsley to understand that. So in bourgeois conceptions of history appear only to be a series of accidents, a series of dead facts, as it were. But for Marx, and following on from Hegel, historical development had a law-governed motion to it. There was a relationship between accident and necessity in history. So when Proudhon comes out with a phrase like "all property is theft," Marx is at pains to point out, well, actually, no, hold on. Workers are exploited not just because they are ripped off, as it were, by the ruling class. Workers are exploited because they actually take part, supposedly as equal participants in a contractual relationship, and all the rules of bourgeois jurisprudence are observed, and as a consequence of that, poverty is a necessary condition for the existence of wealth, and as a consequence of that, the proletariat is exploited by the bourgeoisie. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's approach was rather based upon a notion not of proletarian revolution as such, but the idea of workers' associations and cooperatives and mutualism, as it were, so mutual societies, for example. And of course, you can start to see how the influence of this did spread widely throughout Europe. And of course, we have cooperative societies and mutual societies and credit unions and so on, all of which would have been heartily approved of by Proudhon. But there's a strange kind of contradiction in many of the anarchists, as we'll see. So, for example, Proudhon had no qualms about taking his seat in the French Parliament in 1848. But the point about Proudhon as well was that he was a federalist and a decentralist, and his writings were extremely influential. So when we come to look, for example, at the Paris Commune, among all the communards, the majority of them would have been the adherents to Proudhon's ideas rather than that of Marx. But as we'll see, as history takes its inevitable direction, or it takes the direction that it does, shaped by the forces around it, the kind of stated aims of people like Proudhon were often swept aside, and Proudhonists took rather different positions in the Commune, for example, than you might expect from the actual writings of Proudhon. So in principle, Proudhon was opposed to violent revolution. He thought that revolution would just come about, as it were, by the spread of mutual associations and cooperatives. He was opposed, for example, to the idea of the nationalization of land. And there were contradictions in his work as well, because on the one hand, he would say that property is theft, but on the other hand, assert that the ownership of property was the only real guarantee against the domination by the state. So on the one hand, he has a kind of notion of the state as a kind of guarantor of the interests of the bourgeoisie, but on the other hand, he's also saying that for artisans too, he regards the ownership of at least personal possessions and small amounts of property as the only guarantor you've got against the oppression of the state. Now, of course, I've met very few people who would call themselves a Proudhonist today, but if you look at some of the pronouncements of the Green Movement or other organizations, you start to see this almost dewy-eyed reverence for the idea of returning to a period of simple commodity production of artisans. And many of Proudhon's adherents were, in fact, from a kind of artisan class. This is Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin. Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin. He was a sort of minor Russian noble. I thought he was a count, but I've actually found it quite difficult to find whether he had an actual title. But he was a member of the Russian nobility. He grew up on an estate of around 300 serfs, and he was the son of Alexander Mikhailovich Bakunin. The middle name in Russian is a patronymic. So here Bakunin initially went to a kind of military school with the possibility of a future career as an artillery officer, which he detested, and from about 1835 wanted to live the life of a bohemian student. Eventually ended up at the University of Berlin in 1840, and like many of his time, occupied himself with the philosophy of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He met both Marx and Proudhon in Paris between 1843 and 1845, and was hugely influenced by Proudhon. And to a certain extent by Marx. And he held quite, at this time, really Marx in very, very high regard and as it were, deferred to him. And if you read some of his writings, much of which is incredibly confused, as I will go on to demonstrate, he was quite deferential towards Marx's understanding of Hegel. He was of Marx's understanding of political economy. But in the 1840s, certainly, his grasp was very limited. There's a few kind of places where Marx speaks quite a little approvingly of Bakunin in one sense, in that after he came back from exile and joined the International Working Men's Association in 1863, Bakunin, Marx is reported to have said that he's one of the few people in the workers' movement of the time who seems to have actually improved, who's come on, who's learned something over the course of his experience. And it was quite a significant experience as well. He took part in the revolutions of 1848 in both Prague and Dresden, as I said here, and was sentenced to death, another one. And he was imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress, and then later the Schusselburg fortress near Petersburg. They're both near Petersburg, before being finally exiled to Siberia in 1857. And he escaped through a kind of rather circuitous route via Japan and New York, and eventually ended up in London and joined the International Working Men's Association in 1863. By the 1872 Congress, after the Paris Commune, the split between Bakunin and Marx intensified. There are other things I could mention in Bakunin's work. You see, rather like Blanqui, Bakunin was interested in conspiratorial groups. He, like Proudhon, was a Freemason. We need to put that into context of the time. Being a Freemason was actually had a kind of a radical content, albeit a rather mystical one, in the sense that it was a secret society and it was an organization in which one could meet like-minded people in a kind of organization which was if you like, worshipping reason rather than the Roman Catholic Church, or in the case of Bakunin, the Orthodox Church. So Bakunin took issue, as we'll see, really with the whole question around the state, as far as Marx is concerned, and accuses Marx repeatedly of being a statist, if you like, somebody who wants a strong state. His writings are contemptuous of intellectuals, and he speaks highly of the lumpen proletariat as the flower of the proletariat. And I'm going to read a couple of little lines that I took from Bakunin's writing, just to show you just how weird it is and just how confused it often is at times. Quoting from Bakunin in his critique of Karl Marx, Bakunin writes, "The policy of Bismarck is that of the present. The policy of Marx, who considers himself to be his successor and his continuator of the future." And later, the people's state of Marx, in the people's state of Marx, there will be, as we are told, no privileged class at all. All will be equal, not only from the juridical and political point of view, but from the economic point of view. Now, I'm really not sure to what extent Bakunin had read Marx. We know he had taken an advance on translating volume 1 of Capital into Russian, but clearly got bored with it, and the money was all spent before the job was done. And this was a kind of feature of Bakunin. He didn't really apply himself greatly to anything in particular. His activity largely was on the basis of spontaneous intervention, spontaneous provocation of uprisings and insurrections, often without any kind of calculation about the likely outcome of that event, and without any kind of appreciation of what the consequences are of having a premature intervention in that way, a premature insurrection. So let's just take another little thing from chapter 4 of his critique of Marx. Let us consider the real national policy of Marx himself. Like Bismarck, he is a German patriot. He desires the greatness and power of Germany as a state. Well, I've heard Marx accused of a few things in my time, but that isn't one of them, really, except by Bakunin. Bakunin appears to have detested, been hostile to Germany, and regarded the idea of German unification as being about simply concerned with the aggrandizement of Bismarck's Germany, rather than being about the possibility of developing the forces of production without the impediments of lots of different nation states, as indeed was the case in Italy. So his opposition to the state was as opposition to the state as state, without any real kind of understanding about Marx's understanding of what the state was. Whatever else you can say about Marx, is he wasn't somebody who was advocating egalitarianism. He recognized that people were fundamentally different, and which is why in the critique of the Gotha program, he is at pains to point out that the higher stage of communism is not about equality, which he regards as a bourgeois concept, but instead as the ultimate stage of communism will be from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. We're different, and therefore, that needs to be taken account of. And in fact, recognizing that the bourgeois demand for equality is a demand for actual inequality, because an equal measure applied to fundamentally different people is, of course, fundamentally unequal. Let us see what he says about the proletariat, for example. He says, by the flower of the proletariat, I mean, above all, that great mass, those millions of non-civilized, disinherited illiterates, whose masses Marx and Engels mean to subject to the political regime of a very strong government. Marx and Engels took the view that, of course, the proletariat is, in a sense, the universal class, the class that will abolish all classes. And from that point of view, that's why the proletariat is in a leading role. Whereas for Bakunin, he sees the poorest of the poor as being the revolutionary class, whether they're peasants, whether they're lumpen proletarians, and so on. And this has had a direct consequence in terms of the political interventions of Bakuninists, as we'll see in Frederick Engels' little work, simply called The Bakuninists at Work. I've put Kropotkin in here, Pyotr Alexeyevich Kropotkin, almost as a footnote, really, but I think it was important to include him, not because he had any real debate with Marx. That is mostly focused on Proudhon and Bakunin, who were far better known in their day than Marx. Kropotkin, by contrast, was very well known in anarchist circles and was actually one of the few people who wrote reasonably coherent stuff, whether one agrees with it or not. He came from an interesting background. And here I've also included him because later on what we'll go and look at is, for example, the important correspondence between Karl Marx and Vera Zasulich. about whether there was the possibility that the Russian Obshchina, the peasant commune, could form the basis of a future socialist society in the context of the Russian Empire. I'll leave that aside for now, but that's a sort of tantalizing glimpse of what to look forward to when we come to look at Marx and the Russian Marxists. But here, Kropotkin it alludes to this and in a sense prefigures some of that discussion. He was a prince. Well, the Russian title is knyaz, which isn't the same as a prince in British nobility, but nevertheless he was a prince, and he was also a former page de chambre. He was a page, like an equerry to the Tsar directly. He was also an accomplished geographer and geologist, hugely influenced by Bakunin and Proudhon. Was imprisoned in 1874 for his activism against the Tsar, and for that was exiled took refuge in Switzerland, France, and London. I only really mention him because of that important link, as it were, to what I would regard as the Russian Narodnik tradition. This is the tradition of a kind of agrarian-based socialism. One sees it in the writings of Lev Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace. One sees it in the kind of writings of the Narodniks before a proletarian Marxist party comes into being, and Kropotkin was very much part of that. Bizarrely, he supported the Allied parties during World War One, but subsequently returned to Russia after the February Revolution, and was very critical of the Bolsheviks. Like Kropotkin, like Bakunin and like Proudhon, he was very much in favor of mutual aid and decentralization. Again, drawing upon this kind of Russian idea of the peasant commune. You see, feudalism wasn't really abolished in Russia until 1862, and the peasants often lived in a kind of communal kind of arrangement where fields would be rotated and land shared out between the peasants. And this idea of a direct democracy of the Russian Obshchina, the peasant commune, was seen as being one possible way in which there might be a Russian road to socialism, as it were. While he was in London, one of the things he did was found the journal Freedom, which I think it's still notionally going in terms of it being a British anarchist publication. But there was no kind of debate between Kropotkin and Marx. It's just that he is that interesting link with the Narodnik tradition. Of course, this brings us neatly on to the central thing, the most important aspect of the debate between Marx and the anarchists, is the question of the state. In a number of places, Marx talks about the Paris Commune, and this important point made by Engels in the one revision that was made of the Communist Manifesto in the light of the Paris Commune was the extent to which the state was something that could be taken hold of by the working class and socialism brought about by using the state. And this famous quote by Engels, and of course it crops up elsewhere. One thing especially was proven by the Commune, is that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purpose. But what we'll go on to see later, of course, is that both Marx and Engels, in a sense, were aware of the nature of the state in a way in which Proudhon and Bakunin were not. So, for example, you see the contradiction in Bakunin's writings, where he seems to fail to understand that property relations, as they are under capitalism, and indeed property relations between independent artisans, are mediated by the state. we relate to one another through a series of contractual forms, and the state stands there as as a contractual guarantor. The state isn't merely just the monopoly of violence, as it were, but it's also only exists insofar as there is class antagonism. For Marx, in order to get rid of the state, you first have to get rid of the class antagonism. Whereas for Proudhon, for Kropotkin, for Bakunin, the state is something which needs to be got rid of in itself. The state seems to have no relationship to the economic basis of society. From that point of view, there is a tension around the whole question about what the state actually is. So let's turn to this question about the dictatorship of the proletariat, because it does crop up rather a lot. The whole basis of Bakunin's critique of Marx and Engels was what they regarded as their statism. People may have different views on this, but I think one of the things that's often overlooked is that what the word dictatorship means. And the word dictatorship didn't mean to Marx and Engels what it does to us today. When we think of a dictator, we think of Hitler or Mussolini or Augusto Pinochet, one of Margaret Thatcher's mates. Marx and Engels were thoroughgoing classicists, and when they were thinking about a dictator, they were thinking about the dictators of the Roman Republic. And this is before Augustus, so we're looking at the period when the kings of Rome were overthrown, and instead a republic instituted with consuls occupying the kind of kingly role and answerable to the Senate. A dictator in ancient Rome could be appointed for a particular period of time and would still be answerable to the Senate, even for things that they did during their dictatorship. And a dictator might be appointed for a particular period to deal with a particular emergency. So if the Vandals are at the gates of Rome, for example, a dictator could be appointed to cut through all the normal rules and regulations and just get things done. But even if they used methods which were normally not acceptable to the Republic, they would still be answerable for them in principle, and they would also be subject to recall by consuls and indeed even tribunes of the plebeians, whose position was inviolable in the context of the Roman Republic. So when Marx and Engels are talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's like when they talk about the proletariat. They didn't use the term proletariat just out of badness. They used it because it was the class of landless laborers in ancient Rome. And similarly, a Roman dictator during the Republic would have occupied a particular position for a particular to achieve a particular thing. So again, famously, the postscript to the 1891 edition of the Civil War in France by Friedrich Engels. Engels says, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen. Do you know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. So we will. So as you'll be aware, Paris Commune followed after a lengthy siege of Paris, following, as I think as Victor Hugo put it, the debacle, name of his great novel, of the defeat of France during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. It was indeed a debacle. The Great Battle of Sedan, in which Louis Napoleon himself was captured and effectively, therefore, ended the empire in favor of the Third Republic, which was established in September 1870. Most of the communards were Blanquist. The Blanquists in particular seem to occupy a particularly important role with regard to the leadership of the National Guard. And probably the majority overall were Proudhonist. And there were relatively few Marxists in the Commune. One, Jean Longuy, of course, later became Marx's son-in-law. So just a glimpse of some of the things that were declared by the Commune: a complete separation of church and state, the remission of rent, the remission, for example, of all debts as a result of, so pawnbrokers had to give back the stuff without you having to pay them, they having to pay the interest. Deputies were paid no more than the people that they represent and could be recalled at any time. The death penalty was abolished. The guillotine was taken out and ceremonially burned to the cheers of all the crowd. And the declaration of the Commune was precipitated by the surrender of the French Republic to the Prussians. And as a consequence, one of the things that was going to happen was that the weapons of the National Guard were to be handed over to the Prussians, except for small arms to retain law and order, as it were. The National Guard included every eligible citizen within France and every eligible citizen within Paris, and was in excess of 300,000. So rather than a standing army, what you have is the citizens in arms in the context of a well-organized militia, and who had incidentally paid for their cannon, and they were rather obsolete muzzle-loading weapons, but nevertheless, the citizenry of Paris had paid for them, and when they were ordered to hand them over to the Prussians, they were having none of it. So they retained them for themselves. And the other aspect of the communards was that many refugees from the German-occupied parts of France had come into Paris, and actually these were typically the poorest, and were often workers themselves, and took to joining the National Guard in numbers. The foreigners, indeed. I read a lovely little book I think it was by an account by Edwin Childs, who was an English communard, who didn't stay to the end. He was discharged after the surrender, honourably. But it gives a fantastic account of life in the Commune in his book, The Siege of Paris. So another feature of the state and terror, as it were, is just an understanding of the terror of the bourgeoisie, an understanding of the terror of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which arguably is what we face every single day. In the aftermath, because often people used to complain, indeed Hegel, being a fan, as it were, of the French Revolution, turned against it because of the terror. But the terror killed relatively few in the Great French Revolution of 1789. But by contrast, an estimated 15,000 communards were executed, the last of whom was shot up against the wall in the cemetery of Père Lachaise. A further 15,000 were imprisoned or exiled. So the importance of this, it was the working class in arms administering power on behalf of the proletariat, in the interests of the proletariat, and to subordinate the bourgeoisie. Marx, being the scientific socialist that he was, advised people not to do it. I just want to go back one slide. Apologies, there was some little footnote I wanted to add. Marx advised them not to do it. Don't do it, because he recognized that the balance of forces was so enormous against the communards that their defeat would be likely to set back the workers' movement for generations. And of course, he was subsequently proven to be right. But what he did say is, once you've taken power, march on Versailles. At that time, the communards had 300,000 people in arms, and there were only 40,000 government troops at Versailles. March on Versailles. The communards reverentially mounted a guard over the Bank of France with millions of francs in gold that could have been used to propagate the revolution. But again, they just simply mounted a guard and looked after it for the bourgeoisie on their behalf. The little footnote I wanted to add was a fascinating one. All these brave communards standing on the barricades here when it was decided who was going to be shot immediately and who was going to be sent into exile in New Caledonia or Devil's Island or wherever else, often there were two things. One was, is that you in this photograph? It looks like you, so you'll be shot. Something to bear in mind. Another one was they would look at people's hands. If you had smooth, soft hands, then they were likely to be an intellectual or a professional, and therefore probably in a leadership role, and you were more likely to be shot. Whereas if you had rough hands, you might end up being exiled to New Caledonia. It was one of the first examples I know of photography being used to execute revolutionaries. This is Louise Michel. I thought I'd just mention her as well. Not all anarchists are men. The important thing about her is that she was an active fighter. She was a member of the National Guard. There was another nice, should have used that one really, a nice picture of her in uniform. She was the illegitimate daughter of a domestic servant and the master of the house. But was educated, and she corresponded with Victor Hugo. She originally she was one of a number who started up the Society for the Demand of Civil Rights for Women. After the Commune, she demanded to be executed and flatly refused to be released when it was offered to her, but she regarded it as demeaning. She wanted to stand with her comrades. When she was exiled to New Caledonia, she spent her time teaching the native people and took their side when they subsequently rebelled against the French. And it was actually in exile that she became an anarchist. I won't dwell on her, but I do just sort of like her really. But she followed to return to Paris in 1880 following amnesty, and she ended up attending the Anarchist Congress in London in 1881 and met, among others, Sylvia Pankhurst, and later met Emma Goldman. The other thing that she should be remembered for is that she led a demonstration in 1883 with a black flag, and this was the origin of the black flag of anarchism. In conclusion, then, I want to talk about Frederick Engels' little essay, "The Bakuninists at Work." The link is there as part of the reading for this. The Bakuninists at Work, it's a cracking little essay. It's very quick to read. It follows the actions, and if you cast your mind back to what I've been saying about Proudhon and Blanqui and Bakunin, it looks specifically at the disastrous decisions that the Bakuninists in particular had made in the context of the First Spanish Republic. So in 1873, you have the abdication of Amadeo I. This is on the basis of a Spain that's fighting the Carlists. These are the adherents of Don Carlos, another branch of the Orleans family that were pretenders to the Spanish throne. And instead, Engels is scathing, as you might expect, and it's a short essay and well worth a read, and it's on the Marx Engels Internet Archive. So what you see is, on the one hand, the Bakuninists abstain from taking part in elections. And so they absolutely therefore guarantee that it's only bourgeois Republicans that will be elected. Where there were a few workers' representatives elected, they didn't have a particularly coherent program. It wasn't focused on anything to do with the liberation of the workers or anything of the sort. The other point that Engels makes is, again, it's the scientific way in which Marx and Engels weigh up the balance of forces. Engels at one point says, look, Spain was a backward country, had no chance really of having a proletarian revolution in the context of Spain. A bourgeois republic would have been a progressive step forward. And from that point of view, the decision of the Bakuninists to abstain simply meant that the only Republicans that were in power were bourgeois Republicans. And so therefore, cracking name, Francisco P. y Margal, apparently P would have been his father's surname, and Margal would have been his mother's surname, and it's a Catalonian form of name. And instead of supporting P. y Margal, who put forward a whole series of highly progressive measures. Here's an interesting thing. P. y Margal was a Proudhonist. and was the foremost translator of Proudhon into Spanish. His presidency lasted a relatively short period of time, but instead of being supported by the Bakuninists, instead of a progressive democratic republic in the context of Spain with very little developed industry except in Barcelona and one or two other places, instead the Bakuninists set about a series of insurrections in different cities and the establishment not of a workers' republic, but a series of revolutionary juntas. Remember Bakunin's interest in the flower of the proletariat, the lumpen proletariat, at one point setting free people in prisons to help bolster the troops on the barricades. You know, these were people who were murderers and worse. In the belief that somehow the most wretched of society are going to be the most militant. And so the failure of electoral politics and also noticing the contradiction. Here's Pierre Margal, who is a Proudhonist, who takes office first as Minister of the Interior under the first president, Estanislao Figueras, and then subsequently becomes president himself, and trying to institute reforms using the bourgeois state. But in the context of Spain at that time, it would have been a significant advance for the workers themselves. But that was completely undermined by the cantonal rebellion of 1873 to 1874. And sticking again to the anarchist idea of autonomy and of the free association of small cantons, each of these were eventually picked off one by the Spanish army. Engels, of course, who was an active belligerent in the revolutions of 1848, using his experience as a Prussian artillery officer to very good use, says that in 1848 it was by necessity that you had to fight because Germany was fragmented into lots of different little states. But here, what had been a necessity in Germany was embraced as a kind of orthodoxy, as it were, by the Bakunists. We have to set up little cantons, and each of those will be independent, which made any kind of joint action between them very, very difficult. The consequence of the failure of the Bakunists to support even because of their opposition to the state as such, so their failure to support a bourgeois democratic state, albeit with a Proudhonist at its head, was that you ended up with, first of all, the military dictatorship of Francisco Sereno, and then the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. Later on, of course, all of this will have a kind of dark reverberation in the outcome of the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. And once again, cantons were being demanded there, and with similar kinds of outcomes in terms of disastrous decisions in the context of the relationship between anarchism and Marxism. Thank you, comrades. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was really, really interesting, really fascinating introduction to the very big question of anarchists and Marx and Engels. Comrades, if you want to come in, ask a question or make a contribution, please click raise hand. I've got a few questions for you. You'll be pleased to hear. Firstly, it made me laugh when you mentioned this, all property is theft. If anybody's watched Oppenheimer, $100 million it cost to produce Oppenheimer. It's all about, was he a Marxist? Was he a communist, etc. You'd think they researched it a bit. So a few minutes into the film, he's being all clever, flirty with his communist squeeze, and they want to outdo each other. Who knows more about Marx? And he mentions all property is theft. This is quite clearly known, a very well-known phrase by Marx. I think, what the hell? They couldn't even research that little thing when Marx clearly argued, as you outlined, argued against that anarchist phrase by Proudhon. Now, on the last bit, let's start with that. The experience of Bakuninists in practice, because they were given orders when the Bakunin to not engage with the politics, not engage with the elections, etc. I mean, that is an interesting question, isn't it? How should, and it's still around this question, how should people who consider themselves communists, who want to abolish the state, who want to do away with it, how do we engage with, reforms? Do we call for reforms? How do we call for reforms? Does that make us reformists? I mean, it's a good formulation. I think that we could fight for reforms without being reformists. What's the difference, though? How do you do that little, it's a fine line to a lot of people. How do you see the difference?
I mean, the reforms that P was putting forward were things like, education for kids, and stuff that Marx would have, which you would have recognized from the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto's got a nice big list of reformist demands, and of course, ultimately, Marx wanted to see the end of all of it. But of course, in making those demands, you immediately putting forward a challenge to the bourgeoisie, not just the state, a challenge to the bourgeoisie. If you're going to say, when you say that there's no magic money tree, or, well, open the books. Hang on a minute, you can afford to fight a war at the drop of a hat, so finance this, school dinners or whatever. And I think there are times, of course, when Marxists have gone into electoral politics and have wasted their time, because what they've ended up doing is tail ending the rotting corpse of social democracy, and in so doing have helped to keep that above ground a bit longer than it needs be. And I think that's why Marxists need to organise as Marxists. Whether they join the Labour Party or not is a moot point, and whether it's actually worth the energy. Or they should be putting forward separate demands, but there's no harm in reformist. I mean, imagine what would have happened if a proper bourgeois democratic republic had been established in the First Republic. Instead, what you got was the restoration of an absolutist monarchy.
It's a lot of so-called Marxists at the moment in Germany involved in the Linke, and they are managing capitalism basically when they're in government. And I think it's got to do with a lack of a program for communism, isn't it? They might be defined Marxists, etc., but unless you combine your reforms, your fight for reforms, with a program that goes way beyond, I think that's where they fall down. In terms of Bakunin, then, he's another interesting one, isn't it? You've been a bit too nice on him, actually, I think, because he was mad. He had some really wacky ideas. It's all, you read his stuff and on Marx, he's scathing, isn't he? Marx is an authoritarian, like all Jews are. Actually, he's really anti-Semitic. He says the Jews are authoritarian and we have to fight them, etc. He's bonkers like that. But he's also, is all about being, we have to not accept authority, etc., etc. Apart from, me and my 99 friends who are going to run Europe. He actually had this idea that 100 people, an invisible dictatorship, isn't it? That was his idea, to have a self-appointed, non-elected, can't be challenged, etc. 100 people running Europe, and something like Africa, backward, etc. That could be run by 70 people. Not in an open way, but behind the scenes. And I think that is, it sounds absolutely bonkers, but it does remind me a lot about, when anarchists today want to, sort of deny the need for, voting. Voting is boring, that's anti-democratic, etc. We have to come to consensus. What happens when you have to consensus? It means the minority isn't heard, it is a dictatorship of some people in the room who are running things. So I think it's still a hugely important problem that Bakunin and his ideas of being anti-authoritarian ends up being hugely more authoritarian and dictatorial than anything anybody else has put forward, really. What do you think about his method of organizing?
Both Bakunin and Proudhon were rabidly anti-Semitic, and there is an argument that says, well, it kind of wasn't central, the anti-Semitism wasn't central to the ideas of Proudhon. But actually, it was what has been described, I think, as there's the socialism of fools. It was the idea that the Jews were an international controlling part of the bourgeoisie, and therefore that's why they were anti-Semitic. And Proudhon wrote it privately in vituperative language of his hatred of Rothschild and various others. And it was exactly that, the kind of socialism of fools, a failure to understand the difference between the ruling class and the proletariat, and identifying Jews as being part of the bourgeoisie. And of course, actually, under Hitler, that game was exactly played, wasn't it? The Jews were identified as being part of the oppressing class, and the SR targeted Jewish businesses for that reason, for that sort of popular kind of idiocy. So it was very much, and of course, as you say, they were both in the end as authoritarian as any Stalinist, because this is the contradiction, particularly with Bakunin. He was hostile to intellectuals who he regarded as a new class, but he, of course, was himself an intellectual, albeit not a very good one. And you see this kind of bizarre kind of. I mean, I won't mention Russell Brand as a fan of abstentionism or somebody who would be attracted to anarchism, but it had that flavour to it, this idea that, don't vote, what we need is a revolution, ignoring the role that can be played by elected representatives as tribunes of the working class, providing they are tribunes of the working class and not kind of opportunists who are seeking to feather their own nest or advance some miserable career in local government.
So Karl Liebknecht, for example, I mean, somebody just asked in the chat, what has voting ever achieved, except after World War II? I'm not even sure what that refers to, but Karl Liebknecht was the sole representative in the German parliament who stood up against war credits, etc. So, it was just only one person, but I mean, we remember his opposition, we remember his speeches to this day, because he used parliament as a platform. And I think that's a good way, when we're not near a revolution, you use parliament, you use elections to make propaganda for communism, for something that goes beyond the status quo. Isn't it that how you engage? Millions of people are not yet revolutionary. The question is, how do we win them over? So you use every platform that you can possibly use, including parliament, which gets you into the media, etc. But I think a lot of socialists over the years, over the decades and today, have probably lost a little bit of sight of that, and they think this is the end. You have to go into parliament, and that's how you fight for socialism. And then one day we'll vote for a more left-wing Labour government that will get us socialism, and that's of course the opposite of what Marx and Engels were arguing. So Bakunin, of course, dictatorship over the proletariat. It very much sounded like a self-appointed dictatorship over the proletariat. But getting back to what they actually meant by it, Marx and Engels, I put it in the chat, and I believe Hal Draper has done a really good job on that. He's gone through all the occasions that Marx and Engels talked about the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat, because it has been used by many on the left to imply dictatorship of the proletariat, not like how Marx and Engels meant it, the rule of the working class, but something that needs, that means we have to be as violent as possible. It has to be a bloodthirsty, it has to be a heavy, terror-laden revolution, blood running on the streets, etc. And Hal Draper actually has gone through the not very many occasions they talked about it and explained, put it in context. And it meant simply rule of the working class, i.e. the majority has to be in charge. And I'll put it to you like that, that actually that, and we've had this discussion about amongst the organizers of Why Marx, how terroristic has a revolution got to be? I mean, no doubt the bourgeoisie is not keen on letting go of its power, but say we've organized 95% of the people, they are in favor of getting rid of the bourgeoisie and establishing something new, then that probably limits the need for violence quite dramatically.
Well, there are various places where Marx and Engels talk about the possibility of a peaceful transition to socialism, and they recognise that in an open, democratic, legally organised society, in principle, it could be far better. And we actually, although there's widespread pessimism, the fact that the proletariat is now by far and away the majority of the population of the world puts us in a far better position than Marx and Engels ever were. I've certainly winced over the years at the bloodthirstiness of various people on the left. I don't know. I think there's no doubt about it that we're going to have to defend ourselves. I mean, I say remembering the death of Pinochet should be as good an aid memoir as any other of what we can look forward to if we don't understand what the relationship has to be between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie in the aftermath of any seizure of power. But it has to be in the interests of, and also that dictatorship of the proletariat was always intended to be a transient period. It's something just to simply secure the rule of the proletariat until such time as socialist relations of production take hold, and the idea of the state withering away. So ironically, the anarchists entered the state and used it in exactly the wrong way. By contrast, what Marx and Engels, and of course, questions are then raised about what the Bolsheviks did and that kind of thing, and we'll come on to that later. But of course, they were in a position where the proletariat had been obliterated, such as it was, and under circumstances which are very different, and were never envisaged by Marx and Engels.
I should say we're not pacifists either.
No,
you nor I. I'm sure there will have to be some kind of terror. Well, terror is a strange word anyway. It depends on how you use these words, isn't it? We'll have to establish the dictatorship of the rule of the working class, and that's probably not going to happen without some violence of some form. But the Chartists had a very good formulation. They call it peaceful if we can, forceful if we must, and I think that's exactly the right way. Not go into thinking we have to kill a lot of people and Rupert Murdoch and all of them up against the wall and we're going to shoot them all. It sounds really really radical, and it's just bullshit, isn't it? So we have to win over most people if we can. Those who can't, they might want to go and live on an island somewhere. I'm also not in favor of chopping Prince William's head off and Charles's head off. Let them go live somewhere else, and if they don't shut up, then we'll talk again and see what we have to do. Smash the state then, or wither away of the state. That's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yes.
How we're doing it.
I mean, the whole point was, of course, the communards instituted a completely different form of state, and one which was much more democratic. And that's the point, is that this isn't the negation of democracy. This is the extension of democracy. What we have at the moment is the negation of democracy. What we have at the moment is every 4 or 5 years, you go put your mark of illiteracy on a piece of paper to choose between one or more representatives of the executive committee of the entire bourgeoisie, and that's what we have. We have the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. We have one party, the party of capital, and all we're choosing between is different shades of that. The dictatorship of the proletariat will be the extension of democracy.
Carlos just asks in the chat, why has it never been translated, dictatorship of the proletariat, into the rule of the proletariat. Well, I think Hal Draper has tried to make that point, but over to you, Ian. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think if Marx and Engels were writing today, knowing that very few people have a classical education, they wouldn't draw upon the Roman dictatura. I think they would draw upon, the rule of the proletariat, the ascendancy, the domination of the proletariat by the proletariat. And a different formulation of words would be used.
Yeah, I mean, I do recommend comrades read that book. Hal Draper has done fantastic jobs on various other issues as well. There's this famous quote as well in the Communist manifestos that communists do not form their own party separate from the proletariat, which a lot of laborites to this day use as an argument not to join any communist party because you have to stay with the Labour Party. It's a mistranslation, and Hal Draper has pointed that out very, very well. In fact, it says the opposite. Communists do form their own party. They have no interests apart from the working class, etc. But do read that book, comrades. I do recommend it because he is really putting it into context what Marx and Engels meant by dictatorship of the proletariat, as well as many other issues. Steve's got a question now, or a contribution. Hi, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian, by the way. Very good and very useful talk. As I was listening to you, I thought for the Republican Labour Education Forum, we ought to do the Spanish First Republic actually as a topic maybe in our next series after Christmas. So I think it's worth going back to that. And I'd forgotten about that example. So it's a very useful little example to look at. And it's probably worth a session on itself. So you never know, we might invite you or whoever to do that talk for us later on. I don't know, we'll see what comrades think. I think, we can frame it, if you like. I want to frame it a different way. We can frame it that Marx believed in the dictatorship of the proletariat, and Bakunin opposed the dictatorship of the proletariat because he believed in immediate freedom. So the anarchists believed in freedom and liberation, and the Marxists, who believed in dictatorship, ultimately totalitarianism, of which Stalinism was the ultimate expression of this idea. Now, that's obviously something wrong with that. I think, as we've already said, but that's how they argue. You can see if we were talking to people, just ordinary people, not people who read all this. We can say to people, if we were using this phrase in a popular in a pub or talking to people, we'd go, well, yeah, we don't really mean by the word dictatorship the dictatorship that you think it means. We mean something completely different. You've got to go away and read a few books by Hal Draper and various other people to really understand what's meant. So I think it's problematic for us. It continues to be problematic for us, not as a theoretical construct, but how do you make that idea popular? And what's the way in which that idea seems to be something that makes sense to people, as opposed to something sounding like violence, blood, murder, and terror? Which, if it comes about, people, if we're threatened with violence, blood, murder, and terror, then people will want to defend themselves. Obviously, they will, and that's what will happen. So I think we have a problem, but with that phrase. Not the concept, by the way, and I think the way that you also explained, Ian, by going back to its roots in the Roman Republic was also very useful. But I want to just frame it slightly differently, in a way I think it can be framed that makes a little bit more sense. And I've argued, as I've done before, that Marx was a Republican communist and Bakunin was an anarcho-communist. And what I mean by that is that for Marx, he saw the republic, a democratic republic, as the way, as you needed to have a state, you needed a democratic state in order to make moves towards socialization. Whereas Bakunin, as an anarchist, wanted not to have a republic. He wanted to go immediately to abolish the state and thus declare freedom, which is what the Spanish Republican example shows where that leads you to. And therefore, you could think that the Paris Commune is an embryonic republic, where it really taught Marx what a real democratic republic could look like. And the Spanish First Republic is another example. They didn't participate in that to show the same thing. And I think if we understand it that way, we can understand why Marx and Engels took the attitudes that they did towards the Paris Commune, which they learned from, and towards the Spanish Republic too, because they weren't immediately alienated by the term republic. They were republicans. They just thought the danger of getting the wrong kind of republic. And you're more likely to end up with a bourgeois republic if you abstained and did not participate in the politics, as you explained. And that's what the anarchists did. By abstaining from the political struggle for a better kind of republic, as it were, to carry that republic, to make it as democratic as it could possibly be, they literally handed the initiative, as it were, to the bourgeoisie. And I think that's what Engels was basically complaining about. So I think that we, as Republican communists, need to explain the term a republic, a democratic republic, to people in a way that people can understand it. And of course, if the working class has power in that democratic republic, then in effect, it is the dictatorship it becomes the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it's not confused with that. So I think if we want to explain to people in a pub what we mean, we're talking about a very democratic republic, rather than explaining to them we want the dictatorship of the proletariat. And oh, by the way, we don't really mean it's a dictatorship after all. It doesn't mean blood and terror and violence, all these terrible things that you rightly, as a working class person, are going to feel frightened about or concerned about or worried about what it means, or we'll end up in a Stalinist dictatorship. That's what we're advocating. We want we want more Stalinism and so on. So that's how I'd like to just reframe, as it were, reframe the argument by using republicanism. It doesn't contradict the Roman Republic, the learning from the Roman Republic, or the Paris Commune, or the Spanish First Republic, or indeed the Spanish Second Republic. That's it.
Thanks, Steve. Do you want to reply to that, Ian?
Just a couple of little things. If we look at the words, res publica, the law of the people, the power of the people, and democratic from demos. Of course, yes, I don't have a problem with it. But there is a feature of republic which is also we have to kind of understand that we perhaps have to draw a line with, and that is the notion of a republic being bound up with universalism. Because I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that any socialist republic, if the proletariat was to take power, the bourgeoisie have to be disenfranchised. And on one level, they will be automatically, in the sense that if our society smashes the bourgeois state and workers are in power in their own workplaces, and our economic power is in seizing hold of the production, then obviously there's no room for the bourgeoisie to have any kind of part in that. Whereas citizenship, which is often tied up with republicanism, implies a universalism of the ownership of oneself and an formal equality before the law. I don't think there's any grounds for extending citizenship to the bourgeoisie. That doesn't mean to say we've got to slaughter them en masse or treat them like dogs. But it does mean that they can no longer administer power, and certainly not through a standing army and those kinds of things. And again, whatever context, whatever concept we use, we're going to have to explain ourselves. Whether we call it. I mean, Bakunin liked to play on the fact that the German Social Democratic Party at the time's paper was called Volksstaat, the People's State. And of course, just the word state was enough for it to be regarded as something oppressive. Whereas you're talking about a democratic republic, you're talking about a republic of the workers. Again, we have to explain ourselves. It's not a bourgeois republic, but you do that.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat that I shall read out or paraphrase, and I'm sure if I get it wrong, don't complain, but come in and ask them yourselves. One person asks, representation always leads to a dictatorship, a election. If you don't all rule ourselves, you'll power corrupts basically. If you have elections, etc., that you can't have that democratically. Was it Lenin that very good phrase? If we all become bureaucrats, then none of us are bureaucrats. If we all run society, nobody runs society. But of course, you have to have a transition to that situation. How do you see that, Ian? How do socialists prevent, socialists corrupting?
I think what we should be arguing for is direct participative democracy. And actually, ironically, I hear occasionally when because I used to, going back to my council communist days, used to hang about with anarchists occasionally, and that whole question about direct participative democracy, and that's at every level. I mean, for most people, their frustration with day-to-day life is concerned with all sorts of things. I mean, in the village of Coxo, where I live at the moment, they're building houses, which is fine. People need houses. No one's actually opposed to the idea of people having houses. What people object to is that they again can't get their kids into the school because the firms that make build the houses make plenty of profit, but they don't contribute anything to improving the infrastructure of the village. And this is a constant source of irritation, and that's why communists should intervene and say, well, look, hang on, Wimpy or Barrett's have made X amount of billions of pounds of profit. Where's the slice that goes for the health centre? What you effectively get is the privatization of liabilities and the privatization of profits and the socialization of liabilities. And why would we not want to have a democratic say in those kinds of issues right on our doorstep? But we're also talking about a society in which we're moving away from commodity production. We're not going to have bankers and hedge fund executives or whatever dictating terms to us. And we would see the abolition of whole sections of what currently constitutes groups of people that dominate us without any kind of democratic accountability whatsoever. So I think the whole idea of a direct participative democracy, okay, there may well be a situation where, if 10 of us decide we want a little park at the end of our road rather than a corner shop, the one person who would have rather had the corner shop has their nose put out of joint. But I don't think this is a kind of insurmountable problem. The important thing is that everybody gets to have their say in it.
And in the here and now, I think also, we do get involved, or well, some of us get involved in elections, but we fight for this current system to become more democratic so that the working class is in a better position to organize and to, build an alternative. So we do call for, accountability, which call for transparency of those elected, and crucially, recallability. Once you've elected an MP, as Steve was pointing out, or what was Ian, 5 years you have to put up with that guy. Then even if he's doing the worst job in the world, you cannot get rid of them. So, we fight for a system where you can get rid of them quickly if they're doing a crap job. The Chartists had a really good slogan, which lots of socialists don't like, but the demand for annual parliaments. Some people think that just means it's total machinery, electoralism all the time. But these people would be on their toes. They would actually fight for what those below actually want. If you can be recalled at least once a year, ideally more often. And I think that's a kind of democracy, which is not socialism, but we would be fighting for those kind of steps towards socialism to get the working class into a position. And that, I think, is the biggest distinction between socialist Marxists and anarchists. So, we have steps to get there. We have steps to put the working class into the position where it's strong enough to, convince everybody else as well of the need for socialism, and be in the position where we can take steps, concrete steps, to make life better for us and show that the working class can take over. It can become the ruling class, the majority, all of us, not 100 people that Bakunin chooses individually by himself. Another question then was by Carlos. Attempts to achieve socialism via democratic means have never succeeded. Was Marx wrong on this fundamental point? So, is democracy the wrong way? And we've kind of touched on that, but perhaps you could answer that question again.
I think that's the point. You can't use bourgeois democracy to bring about socialism. Salvador Allende had effectively a minority government. He was reliant upon liberals or whatever else to maintain his position. They were absolutely adamant they were going. And when you consider what Allende stood for, it was little more than P stood for in the First Spanish Republic, or little more than what Jeremy Corbyn would have stood for. And that kind of bringing about socialism through parliamentary means, I think, is a non-starter. And that's just the point about you can't just use the current form of the state to bring about socialism. You'll very quickly end up in front of a firing squad, I would suggest. The other thing is, of course, Marx was quite clear that, in a sense, democracy is something that we have to learn. We've had generation after generation which sees representative democracy in the bourgeois sense as being the only possible form of democracy that could exist. That people are not in the habit of direct participative democracy, but they'll learn it very quickly. And also, although we've been rightly scathing of anarchism as it was put forward by Bakunin, Proudhon, and the others, it's still worth remembering that things like local communes, cooperatives, and the rest of it have a part to play in terms of people learning the ropes of democracy, and also self-organization is a very important part of what it is to be a communist, and very important part of what it is to be a human. As it stands, you go to work and you do some god-awful job, and then you end up putting your mark of illiteracy on a bit of paper every few years, and that's your lot. But actually, most people, I think, if given the opportunity, could run their own workplaces a bloody sight better than the managers who purport to do it for us. And I don't know, I've never been in any workplace where you can say, well, what if we did this or that? And everybody would agree that's the right thing to do, but they won't let you. They won't let you because the managers have to manage. And then people actually regard that then as a natural feature instead of it being a social feature of capitalism.
Talking about self-organization, I think one of the most obvious ways where anarchists maybe clash with socialists these days is trade unions and the sort of syndicalist approach. I know we've got a session coming up on that, but it is an interesting feature still, and that's still going on today. So you look at unions, be it in Britain today, it's bloody awful. The Unison, the biggest unions, are run by bureaucrats who have no interest at all in challenging or overcoming capitalism. It's all about getting a few more pounds in the pocket, which is important, etc. But that leads a lot of comrades of a more anarchist persuasion to say, well, what we need to do is we need to build separate unions. We have to have pure unions. We have to have unions which fight for political demands and for refugees and etc., which sounds very attractive, but there's something wrong with that, isn't there?
Unions, of course, have taken historically specific different forms and at different times, and will be transformed during revolutionary periods. Although we've been looking at the classical anarchists in a sense, I've always felt that the best thing that George Orwell ever wrote was Homage to Catalonia, and he was in the POUM, the Partido Obrero Unificación Marxistas, and it was, attacked as a Trotskyist organization, which Trotsky wouldn't necessarily have accepted. But nevertheless, it was an idea of a party of Marxist unity, Marxist workers' unity, and similarly, Orwell speaks about the way in which the Communist Party, his opposition to Stalinism, really was consolidated there, and similarly, bourgeois unions. It's not lost on anyone how useless they are, whether it's the Royal College of Nursing or whether it's Unison, or it makes not the slightest bit of difference. You can see that they're all paid a lot more than the people they represent, and have much more interested in having cozy relationships, cozy chats over tea and biscuits, and as they stitch up their own workers. And anything that challenges that. So I would be very much in favour of an independent shop stewards movement or independent movement. And of course, syndicalism is an interesting one. I look forward to the session, because of course that too has taken different forms. Let's remember that at one point the IWW in the United States had between 4 and 8 million members. Why? Because they accepted unskilled workers, they accepted black workers, they accepted Chinese workers, because they were internationalists. And although we have a tendency to say there's Marxists good, anarchists bad, I think there are interesting kind of forms of organization that will be thrown up in revolutionary situations, which won't necessarily fit easily into any particular mold. It's also worth remembering that, Bakunin's ideas still resonate with some people. Even Noam Chomsky, bless his cotton socks, sat there and said, how Bakunin was proven right. I think it's putting a bit, come on, Chomsky, you can do better than that, mate. Yeah.
I was, of course, alluding more to the idea that why communists argue against, sort of pure unions that are communist unions, basically. It sounds, much more radical, etc. But I guess the problem is then that we're not talking to the mass, we're not talking to the mass of the working class who are in those other unions. And unions, as limited as they are, and we should always point out how undemocratic as they are and fight for democratic reforms, etc. But they do organize on the most basic level the working class. I mean, less so these days, but still there's millions of people organized in unions. And if you move away from them, similarly, if you move away from the electoral platform, an electoral field, you take yourself out of the class war, don't you? You kind of leave it to the others to approach millions of people.
The famous assertion by Marx that man, apologies for the sexist language, man makes history, but not just as he pleases, under the circumstances in which he finds himself. In Britain, we have a history of craft unions and general workers' unions. And the tendency was always to regard the general workers' unions as somehow being more progressive, in the sense that they were not like ASLEV, just organising groups of skilled workers, and actually, excluding other groups of workers and so on. But of course, in other countries, in France, the CGT was allied to the Socialist Party. Germany, in the kind of revolutionary period, there was the Communist Workers' Party. Communist General Workers Union, Communist General Workers Union. You there? I don't know. I can't remember. So, there have been communist unions, and there may well be again. When I watched this group of 4 people at the Durham Miners Gala with their IWW banner, it's rather sweet, but we know that's not going anywhere. You're not going to recreate the IWW of 4 million members here in the UK or even worldwide.
Indeed. I've got no more questions or people with their hand up. If anybody wants to ask another question, do it quickly. Otherwise, I'd say we've had a really good meeting. We're finishing a bit earlier than before, but it was a whirlwind through the history of anarchism and why we're not anarchists, although I think a lot of us started off as anarchists because it does sound pretty good, no authority, etc. And then you kind of start to understand, well, authority is not the problem, is it? It's actually if it's unelected, if it's unchallengeable, if it's undemocratic, that's what we don't want. But we want people of authority that we can look up to and who can lead us and who can make decisions sometimes. But we also want to be able to say this is wrong until we're getting to a situation where we can all run society.
Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were extreme libertarians. They wanted individual personal liberty. I mean, I haven't even mentioned Max Stirner, of course, who was arguing for extreme individual liberty. And of course, it's hopelessly contradictory, but Marx and Engels want extreme personal liberty for everybody, so that anyone can, at school I quite enjoyed carpentry and probably still would again. I've never been able to develop that skill or many others besides, because I've always been able to bloody work for a living. The creation of a society in which wage labour is abolished in favour of the complete free development of all human capacities. I can't think of anything more anarchistic.
Indeed. We do have actually now somebody with a hand up quickly. Felicity, we just squeezed you in at the end. Hi.
Hi. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. I'd just like to clarify. Are you suggesting we don't vote? Are you saying people shouldn't vote?
No, not at all.
Good, because I think it's really important that we do vote. And I think you've got to make it clear that under ideal circumstances, certain things occur, but in the society we're in, it's really important to vote because it can bring about, well, definitely get rid of the ruddy Tories at least.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd go, my own personal preference would be to be able to vote for an explicitly socialist candidate or an explicitly communist candidate.
Yes, definitely.
And if I had my
would you promote alternative vote? You know how people are going on about our voting system, or I see that as a deflection. I don't think that's important because you look around the world and you've got proportional representation, but it's caused as much havoc as anything else. We've got so many neo-fascist governments at the moment, and they've got proportional representation. So I personally think it's a deflection. I see it as not necessarily. What we need is a mass party of the left, and I think we will after the 2024 election. I think we will be able to, because I think the Tories will become a rump party. I honestly do, and I'd like to see a party of the left. It won't be a socialist party, but at least a party of the left representing somewhat the views of people who voted for people like Corbyn.
Yeah, okay. First, on voting systems, on the one hand, I'm not that bothered how the executive committee of the bourgeoisie is elected, but first past the post and proportional representation have at different times been used to prevent the left from taking power. In Italy, for example, proportional representation made sure that the Italian Communist Party didn't take power, and was used to make sure that you couldn't get an absolute majority. And one of the reasons why people like Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn have always defended first past the post is because they harboured the view that if you just had a left-wing enough Labour government, it could legislate socialism into being in the style advocated by the Fabians and all the rest of them without revolution. My own feeling is that in the context of Britain, proportional representation would be a step forward, because at the moment we have no voice whatsoever. When we had the referendum on the subject, I voted, holding my nose for the proportional representation that was put forward, despite the fact that it was a ridiculous system. It was worse than single transferable vote. Having any tribunes of the proletariat in office that could make a noise and actually get their voice heard would make a huge difference. And that's not going to happen with first past the post.
Absolutely. It disenfranchises, well, up to 49.9% in a constituency, which is outrageous.
Yeah,
Germany does have a PR system, but it doesn't necessarily mean it gets us closer to socialism, not automatically, but it certainly gives the working class a vote, a voice, and you can have people in parliament who are speaking up. Paul.
Evening. Yes, I wanted to basically reinforce the last point that was made, really, because you'll notice in some Marxist parties in the country, I actually mentioned the Socialist Workers' Party, or SWP, in the chat, because I've got friends in the SWP and some are in Counterfire as well. They're both similar organisations as a result of the split. But one thing I had noticed about them was that they might call for you to vote for a particular party, but they themselves don't actually take part. I know the argument for it. They would dismiss it as bourgeoisie democracy, which it is, but I think as socialists, and for some of us as Marxist socialists, Marxists we should be involved in every aspect of life. So and Ian, with regard to some of the stuff you showed us in the presentation, you've actually demonstrated what happens if certain groups don't take part in elections. And as for proportional representation, like you, Ian, I also voted in that for a yes vote in the AB referendum, despite the fact that it wasn't proportional representation. And the only reason I voted for that one, for a yes vote, is because I saw it as a stepping stone for further electoral reform in the future. My personal preference is for a genuine single transferable vote system where you use the same preference method, but it's designed for electing multiple members of parliament. So, like in Ireland, for instance, they have 3 to 5 members per constituency, and the single transferable vote is a much more democratic way of electing people. I think it is the fairest form of proportional representation. And also from a socialist perspective, some people might argue that it might crowd socialists out of power, but on the other hand, if you've got proportional representation, as Tina mentioned in other meetings, it actually provides the opportunity for other socialist parties to also stand in elections. So, and also the very simple fact about proportional representation is it's designed so that you end up with a parliament that people actually voted for. And as you and Tina have demonstrated or argued, you don't get that under the current sort of system. But as I say, I just wanted to reinforce the point that as Marxists, whatever you think about the current process of bourgeoisie democracy, it's still important to take part in it. Thanks.
Yeah, one of my formative experiences was hanging about Speaker's Corner in London when I should probably. And there was a cracking anarchist speaker by the name of Jim Huggan, He had some nice one-liners. I mean, most people would be familiar with them. If voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. And it doesn't matter who you vote for, the government still gets in. And, it's all good knockabout stuff. And actually, if you look at Proudhon and if you look at Bakunin, Bakunin's a terrible writer and his ideas are all over the place, but you can see how there's an immediate populist resonance in his work. And you can in Proudhon as well, in a way that you don't have the kind of immediate accessibility with Marx. So you see in Bakunin, it's quite scathing about Marx's intellectualism, whilst at the same time kind of deferring to it. It's a bizarre kind of thing. But my feeling is that ideas are important so that we don't make fools of ourselves. Just as we saw in the first Spanish Republic, if there had been a scientific, a thoughtful way of working out what a proper tactic should be, then it would have made a huge difference. In the context of our intervention in bourgeois politics today, we either spend our time in small groups talking amongst ourselves, or we reach out to a wider audience. I think we could get a wider audience in the context of proportional representation. I think people continue, particularly where I am in the northeast of England, people will continue to vote Labour on tribal grounds, if nothing else, just because they've always voted Labour and their parents have always voted Labour. But that's breaking down, it's changing over time. And the fact that the next Labour government will almost certainly be as right-wing, if not more so, than that of Tony Blair, and as prone to warmongering, as prone to siding with imperialist forces and so on, are all going to be opportunities for the left to actually say something. We haven't got a lot going for us in terms of influence, but what we've got is our ideas, and they're a lot better than the ideas coming from the right, or what Tariq Ali calls the extreme centre. Incidentally, I remember in 1979, the Workers' Revolutionary Party got more votes than the Labour candidate lost by. And that works out. So some then say, well, look, that's what happens. You end up just letting the Tories in. Well, I think it just means we should be a bit more intelligent about where we stand candidates, comrades. If you've got a half decent left-wing Labour MP, well, what's the point of standing against them if they're in a highly marginal constituency? Let's use our brains. Whereas, my wish would have been that someone like Julian Assange could have been made to stand against Keir Starmer. But there we go. It's not going to happen.
Indeed. Great. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much, comrades, for participating. I think we've had a really good discussion about anarchism historically, but also, it is still quite popular out there, and it's important that we educate ourselves and others on the dangers that it entails, and the purism and the idea that you don't really have to organize and go through the democratic channels, etc. We're not reformists, but we do fight for reforms in a revolutionary manner with a revolutionary program. I think that is the difference to anarchists who just want to stay out of things. So thank you very much for that, Ian. Next week, very interesting session coming up. Kevin Bean will be talking about the various incarnations of the Social Democratic Party that Marx and Engels were involved with, the SPD in Germany, and how they engaged with the various programs that the party went through. That'll be a very interesting session that can, I'm sure, inform what we're doing today as well. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you, comrades. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.